when someone is transitioning off a GLP-1, our goal is to restore the normal function in the brainstem that regulates all these processes. So there's a good argument to be made that if someone loses significant weight with GLP-1 and they then want to stop the GLP-1, that actually if you introduce our device, they will hopefully maintain their weight loss more than if they just stop altogether and don't have any other interventions.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
Meeting Jason McKeown was like watching someone quietly change the future of healthcare. I first met him through the Rosenman Innovative Programs, where his company, Neurovalens, was honored in 2022, and it quickly became clear that his vision goes beyond ordinary medicine. A UK-trained doctor with a PhD in non-invasive neurostimulation, Jason is not only a doctor or a researcher, he's a forward-thinking leader who has spent more than a decade combining brain science with technology to help people manage anxiety, insomnia, and metabolic disorders. As the founder and CEO of Neurovalens, Jason has developed devices like Modius Sleep and Modius Stress. Both devices have received FDA approval and work by using gentle electrical signals to adjust the brainstem, the part of the brain that controls stress and sleep. His journey was not easy, though. In our conversation, Jason explained how he balanced working as a doctor in the UK while building a startup until 2017, when he made a big decision to focus entirely on Neurovalens. What began as a project inspired by NASA research at UC San Diego has now grown into a mission to make advanced brain therapies available worldwide. What impressed me most was Jason's determination to challenge the norm. Whether he was sharing how veterans can now access Modius devices through the VA, or describing how his team's use of remote clinical trial sped up FDA approvals, his work is all about changing the way patient care is delivered. In this episode, Jason explains the science behind non-invasive neurostimulation, discusses the challenges of growing a medtech startup, and tells how a NASA study on astronauts' metabolisms led to his obesity-focused device. He also shares why treating investors as key customer early on was a game changer for him. Listening to him, you'll see there is still so much to learn about the brain, and that we might be closer than ever to unlocking its secrets. Here's our conversation. Well, welcome, Jason. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a while since you were part of our Rosenman founders. But before we start, I'd like to always start with your personal journey and what take you to where you are today. What inspired you and who inspired you, maybe even?
Yeah. Me personally. So my background's in medicine. So I worked as a doctor in the UK. So I've always been in that kind of healthcare ecosystem. But then in 2016, I got a really great opportunity. I was able to take a visiting position at the University of California in San Diego. And that was in a department called the Center for Brain and Cognition. And really, if I could summarize what that department does, it's looking at innovation in the neuroscience, neurology field. And our concept was we could make non-invasive neurostimulators, devices that put electricity into the brain, but our particular focus was really deep part of the brain. And when we realized, almost without thinking about what disease we were treating, when we realized that technology was viable, then I set up Neurovalens as a medical device company, and we've really doubled down on the medical device. And then in parallel to that, just again personally, so I also have a visiting professor position at the School of Medicine. So I still try to really keep into that whole medical MD side. And then more recently, I moved to a visiting position at Stanford as well, department in neurosurgery.
And so maybe before we talk about Neurovalens, being a doctor at UK and coming to the US, probably you can't practice.
Yes. I could if I did more exams, but the purpose of my position at UCSD at that time didn't require me to actually practice with patients as an MD, but I was carrying out medical, I suppose, research in clinical trials. So my interactions were with clinical trial patients or participants, not people who were seeing me privately as their MD.
Mm-hmm. So the company Neurovalens, you mentioned, is based on the research that you were doing when you were at UC San Diego. Tell us about the journey. How do you get to where you thought, like, well, this is something that I think is a company worthy, that I'm going to spend my time and my life 24/7 at it.
Yeah, I think actually, if truth be told, it was all a bit chaotic almost, or we were. The plan when we look back sounds much more like a plan than it really was when we started. And the person I co-founded the company with, Paul McGeoch, him and I work together in neurosurgery in the UK. And his previous position had been at UCSD, looking at this almost how your brain works, better understanding how certain parts of your brains connect, or your brain connects to other parts. And his almost knowledge and my then interest in electronics, because I'm really passionate about electronics, probably would have done electronics or computers or something in my life had the medicine opportunity not come up. So I was really interested in looking at medical devices that have those elements of electronics in it. So essentially, when Paul and I were almost exploring this concept of, here's the neuroscience knowledge, here's the electronics required to do that, and then we actually started working. Well, could this be a kind of viable product? And we moved through then those traditional stages. So we made like a kind of proof of concept. Early prototypes. We started early kind of pilot studies just to try and flesh out any of the clinical data. But it wasn't until 2017 that I was still working in the hospital, almost full time in the UK when I was there as a doctor, and then trying to build a company on the side. So 2017, I was so not overwhelmed, but there was so much work going on in the company side of things. Then that's when I stopped practicing as an MD and committed full time to Neurovalens and trying to build up that team and build up the research and eventually work through the FDA clearances and approvals.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about Neurovalens, like what is trying to achieve, what's the impact it's trying to accomplish, and how does it work?
So we're a team of about 20, based mostly in Belfast in the UK. I'm in the US a lot, and our VP of commercialization, Kate, she's in the US. She's from Ohio, and as I said, the goal was to try and make a non-invasive stimulator that puts electricity into the brain. But if you dive into that, the diseases or the issues that we treat, we broadly put into metabolic disease and then kind of neurological disease. So although we started looking at obesity indications, those trials are very slow, and the recruitment takes a little while, and they're even just quite long, the studies. So although we started the obesity work or research first, the second project we started, which was a treatment for insomnia, and the third project that we started, a treatment for generalized anxiety, those second and third projects actually have already gotten FDA clearance, and we've just put the Insomnia device, the Modius sleep device, into the market in the US. So doctors are actually prescribing Modius sleep now to treat insomnia and Modius stress to treat anxiety. And then our next submission to the FDA is actually going to be that original work on obesity, which is really exciting. So we hope that's our kind of third. That'll be a de novo application. But the reason I'm saying this, at the time when we first started, you really sort of focus maybe on one area. So for a long time, it looked like we were almost an obesity company, because that's all we were doing right at the start. And then all of a sudden, all these other indications come through. And now, if anything, we look a bit more like a kind of insomnia, mental health type company. But I tend to step back a bit from that, and I just see a range of potential indications, and we're not necessarily focusing more on one disease area, but Neurovalens is very much a non-invasive neurostimulation company.
And how is that? I assume the part that was being stimulated, are they different for 3 different use case?
So maybe to go into the science a little bit more. So our target is your brain stem. So at the top, you've got your kind of what everyone knows is your brain, and that's kind of you as a person. And I'm like moving my hands around and I'm talking. That's all this kind of top part. And then you've got your nervous system and spinal cord, which goes down the back and it goes right out to your fingertips and to your toes. But the connection between those two systems is called your brain stem. And your brainstem controls many, many automatic processes that happen without this top part of your brain, needing to think about it. So I don't need to think about my circadian regulation. I don't need to think about my metabolic control. Ideally, you wouldn't be thinking about your stress response, but actually a lot of people overthink about their stress response, which causes anxiety. So all of those things are controlled automatically. They just happen 24/7 in the background of my kind of brainstem. So what we were able to do was identify a direct and uninterrupted pathway from the surface, and we use nerves that are in your inner ear right into the brainstem. So I sometimes describe it as it's like an Ethernet cable. You plug one end into your computer, you plug the other end into the printer. So we're the computer and we're sending signals down the cable to make something happen then, in this case, in the brainstem. And to answer your specific question then, well, what makes it different for each indication? So the signal that we send down that cable is different for every indication. The patient experiences the same thing. They put a device on their head, they wear it for 30 minutes. It's attached to the skin behind each ear. But what is being delivered depends on the indication. So the frequency, the current, the voltage, the wave shape, potentially, all of those things change with indication. But importantly, and this is maybe something for startups to think about, right back at the beginning, we designed the hardware to be able to do all of that at that time, which was a huge task at that time. But it turns out that it has made all of those subsequent kind of approvals and research projects so much easier because we knew, yes, this is coming in future.
Did you know at that time that in order to tackle different use case, the differentiator will be the frequency?
Yes. Just pretty much we did, yeah. And again, diving into the science, the reason we knew a lot of this is your inner ear, which is effectively the part of the brain that we use to start the process of sending signal. That's been studied extensively, particularly by NASA, because when you go into space, you lose your inner ear. There's no gravity acting on your inner ear. So it's almost like zero stimulation of those nerve fibers. So NASA have done loads of experiments from the sort of even I think early 60s onwards, looking at what happens in scenario A, B, C, and you can actually pull all of these files off the NASA servers and read through everything. So that's actually how we really started. We went through almost line by line, looking for indications as to which frequency might be better for one than the other, or which frequencies do nothing. And then once we narrowed it down, essentially we pick the one that we feel most confident about, and then you'd move into a pilot trial, test it. If you get a good result, then you move into a pivotal trial, test it again, and try eventually to get FDA clearance or approval.
And so you mentioned that right now the doctors are prescribing. How many patients have you been treating so far?
It literally started about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, that's exciting.
So the two channels that are active are just direct to patients. So if the patient wanted to buy our device for Insomnia, they can do so on our website. It's just neurovalens.com. But they need a prescription. So either their doctor can send us a prescription, or they can fax it or scan it. Or if you want, on our website, we can actually have almost like a virtual consultation, and a prescription is issued at the time that a patient buys the device. So that's our kind of primary channel. And actually, prescriptions coming in. But the other area that we're really excited about is we just went on contract with the VA. So VA doctors, and that was literally just a day or two ago. So VA doctors can now prescribe both our Insomnia and our anxiety device for any of the veterans who have those symptoms.
And then the device is being covered by the VA.
Yes, that's correct.
That's always a challenge that's hard to overcome. So congratulations. So tell me more about the original idea for the obesity, like where things are right now and why you're excited about this.
Yeah, obesity was our original work. It's actually quite interesting. As you go through, you kind of pick favorites. So for a long time, it was my favorite one to work on and design the trials. And I mean, some of the results that we achieved were just really impactful. You know, people are emotionally very so excited whenever you can help them, you know, lose a significant amount of weight. And then actually moving into the insomnia anxiety and now into PTSD is probably going to be our fourth one. If anything, it's the one I'm most excited about, actually. We can maybe talk about it later, but we're hoping for approval early in 25 for that. But the obesity work goes back to what I said around those NASA papers that we found. So in space, it's well known now, actually, but at the time it wasn't understood. But astronauts actually develop quite often pre-diabetes or even potentially diabetes, and they also increase their fat, particularly visceral fat, which is the fat around the organs, and bone density decreases as well. And for a long time, it was assumed that this was because there's no gravity, so they're not really loading their bones and their muscles don't have to strain as much. And that is true, but it doesn't paint the whole picture. There's actually an element of your nervous system that controls bone density, muscle mass, fat mass, particularly visceral fat. And part of that comes from the signals that are in your inner ear. So what NASA did, they took animals like mice and I think guinea pigs, and they had them in these really nice like environments, so like big kind of cages and everything. The mice were just running around, but what the mice didn't realize were these cages were actually spinning around in a hypergravity environment, so like a 2G environment. And what happens when you increase gravity is those mice gain quite a bit of muscle, but they significantly reduce their body fat, even though they eat the same amount of calories and they do the same amount of physical activity. So for a long time then, this was known as a metabolic shift, because you haven't changed your input, you haven't changed your output with physical activity, but your body composition changes quite dramatically. So its utilization of energy changes, so it shifts to this more athletic state. But it wasn't until then, the 2002, I think, 2002, 2004, they repeated these experiments, but it was with a mouse who had a mutation of its inner ear. So it didn't sense the gravity, it didn't actually experience it. And then in those mice, there's absolutely no change in muscle, bone, fat. So that was the first time that they realized there's a very specific thing happens with one of the receptors in your inner ear, and it relates to how much or how your body uses energy. So our theory was we could replicate that without the big spinning cages. We'll just put electricity in. And we did a pilot study. We had really good results. We saw a really nice fat loss. And then we took some funding from investors, and then we moved into a full pivotal trial. We had a site in the UK. We had sites across the US. I think it was maybe more than 200 patients or whatever in that trial. And they wore our device every day for 6 months. And we DEXA scanned everyone, basically. Although during the period of COVID, it was quite tricky trying to DEXA scan people, but we DEXA scanned most people, actually, and we were able to show a really significant reduction in visceral fat. So, the fat around your tummy. Mm-hmm. So I think the active group had about a 13% reduction, whereas the sham group, which also is a headset, it puts stimulation in, but it's like a slightly different stimulation. They only had something like a 4% reduction. So almost proves the theory that what we're saying is correct. Your energy utilization is definitely influenced by this part of your brain. But we've now taken it to that stage that we've shown this in a double-blind RCT. We've actually prepared the submission for the FDA, and that's hopefully going to be with the FDA probably early December. So we're hoping for approval sometime the first half of next year. So it's really exciting, and it's really exciting to see that first project that we worked on so long ago has now almost reached a conclusion.
You mentioned earlier that you guys went ahead with the insomnia and anxiety, and because the obesity takes longer because of the study. What are the challenges oftentimes when, why is it more challenging to get the obesity study versus the other two?
Yes. This is actually one of the positive things that's come from COVID, and there's a huge transition to remote studies. So years ago, even from a documentation point of view, getting a signature, like a wet signature for consent, it was always just this argument, you must do it in person. So you were asking people to give up a lot of their time to drive. The parking's always terrible. It's just difficult for people, and they have busy lives and kids to pick up at school. And there's just so many reasons why bringing someone to a hospital or a clinic just it de-incentivizes them so much that people just don't want to do it. So that tends to make recruitment take a lot longer. It's much more expensive. You're paying for clinicians' times. There are some challenges, like blood tests, for example. You can't really avoid blood tests, so they have to be done in the clinic. The DEXA scans or the MRI scans have to be done in the clinic. But if you can design a trial that has as many remote elements as possible, that trial recruitment at least will be so much quicker than a trial that is entirely clinic based for all assessments and or for initial assessment, and then for the onboarding, and then the follow up. So the reason our two insomnia and anxiety trials were so quick is we were able to make them fully remote. So you consent. We set up a virtual consent, like an e-signature, in a way that's compliant with the FDA. It's not just like a normal e-signature. We onboarded them via Zoom. We had clinicians speak to them, carry out the assessment, and then we did sort of follow-up assessments via Zoom every 2 weeks or whatever it was. And because you've removed all those barriers, the proportion of people who express interest, who end up on the trial, is just completely different than when it's an inpatient trial or in-clinic trial. So that is the single biggest thing that we have done, which just makes recruitment so much more cost-effective, timely. Everything just works far better. And that's what we've actually adopted in all of our trials now going forward, as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm sure when you're thinking about obesity, now everybody's talking about all the GLP-1. How do you compare to, is that something that's always a challenge too? There's a lot of side effect of, obviously, Ozempic and GLP-1. There's a lot of other challenges, but how is that could be different?
Yeah, there's two ways we look at this, actually. So one is the GLP-1s, although a lot of people are maybe using them off license, they're really for the more extreme cases. So people who are obese, significantly obese, but also have comorbidities, be that, diabetes or hypertension or whatever. And that group of patients, this is a really great solution for them. There is a question around muscle loss, unfortunately. So if you lose a lot of weight with GLP-1, in some cases, I think it's either up to 40 or 50% in extreme cases. That can actually be from muscle. So as long as you're losing fat, generally speaking, that's the main goal. But you want to avoid muscle loss. And the other thing that you want to avoid is, if you stop the GLP-1, then what might be happening, it looks like this is happening, is the person goes back to their original weight, but it's an increase in fat that has caused them to go back to their original weight. So they're now back where they started, but with 50% less muscle. So strangely, you could actually argue that that has made that person less healthy, which is a bit of a conundrum. So the two opportunities we see with our technology is the people who have not reached that stage yet. So if you've gained some weight, you don't really have many options other than diet and exercise. Whereas our trial was designed to show that in that population, whenever you try to lose some of that initial, say, weight gain, you're significantly more likely to achieve a fat loss goal if you use our device. So that's almost like at the early stages of obesity before it gets so bad that you need a GLP-1. And then the second part of where we see a really interesting opportunity is when someone is transitioning off a GLP-1. So our goal is to restore the normal function in the brainstem that regulates all these processes. So there's a good argument to be made that if someone loses significant weight with GLP-1 and they then want to stop the GLP-1, that actually if you introduce our device, they will hopefully maintain their weight loss more than if they just stop altogether and don't have any other intervention. So those are the two areas that we're really exploring right now.
Yeah, that's definitely an exciting space. I know we have a few minutes left. I want to make sure I ask this question. What are some of your lessons learned when you're going in, being a physician and academic, being an academic, and then starting a company, looking back?
Yeah.
What surprised you?
I think there's too many to fully list, but some things that spring to mind would be a lot of people say, in startups, not necessarily med device startups, just in general, you need to really understand your customer. So naturally, you think, well, the patient or the doctor at the very end of this journey, that's who I should be targeting. But I think there's an argument to be made to say that actually in the early stages, your customer is really an investor. So if you need an investor to fund this, then that's who you should be targeting. And everything that you do should be based around convincing that person or that group to provide more investment. So some of the things that we have done at an early stage, they were great when it comes to academia, and we were able to show, published papers, or we were able to, understand the mechanism better. But it didn't actually show to an investor that this was a viable device that was going to be something that could be commercialized and make money. And I think a lot of people who come from academia or from healthcare sometimes find it hard to really understand that distinction. And a lot of the groups that maybe in our kind of cohort, not at Rosamond, just in general, like in the UK, we're kind of part of some groups, like from really early startups to quite advanced now. I think the mistake that a lot of those guys make is they want to do something that's academically really impressive, but if that doesn't align with your next funding milestone, then you actually could end up having wasted a lot of money in terms of what you need maybe to go through all the kind of investment steps. So that's probably my one big take home. I at the early stage, I would consider my investors to be the customers, and my mindset would always be, what's the next best thing that I can do to get me to the next milestone.
Who's the first person who mentioned that as investor, as your customer?
So if you're selling, if you're making an app on a website or on the App Store, or you're doing a non-medical product, you can go to market really quickly. People talk about this MVP, and cash comes in. So those are your customers, those guys who are buying the app or buying your software or whatever. But medical devices, there is no MVP. You either have an approved product which you're allowed to sell, or you do not. So until you get to that point, I would argue that your investor is the customer. And then once you get to the point of, yes, we're on the market, well, that's slightly different. And now you start targeting the doctors or the clinics or the patients. So yeah, we've definitely got that wrong in the past, but thankfully now we're kind of on the other side, and we're now actually out speaking to our patients, and that's where our prescriptions and our purchases are coming from.
What are the things that you see? I mean, you mentioned about being exciting for academic doesn't mean it's exciting for investors. What are the things that you see different from being an academic and being where you are in the startup world?
Yeah. Again, this is I think something people struggle with, but understanding the mechanism for medical devices does not show that the device works. So for example, we get asked all the time in our Insomnia study, or let's even say our anxiety study, what happened to the person's deep sleep and REM sleep and all the stages of sleep, and in the anxiety study, what happened to heart rate variability and everything like or what other biomarkers. And when we went to the FDA initially, we presented this study that was based on that. We're going to look at insomnia, but we're going to look at your brain activity, and we're going to do all these things, and we're going to really understand why this works. And I actually remember the meeting with the FDA. They basically said they're not that interested in any of that. They just want to know if you take a well-defined population of patients, in our case, let's say chronic insomnia, at the time of diagnosis, not treatment resistant, like a really well-defined population. What happens when you treat that population for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever? And that's what your approval is based on. How you treat that group of patients is how you get your indication. Knowing what has happened doesn't actually give you anything in the indication. It's good to know, and it's kind of exciting, and it might help you explore other areas. But that actually doesn't make it any easier for you to get approval, and arguably it's a waste of time and money at this stage if you have limited cash and you want to get from no approvals to your first approval. So we strip back all our trials and we just look at things that get us through. But it's sometimes hard to explain maybe to someone who's been in academia for a long time that actually, yes, this is interesting, but at this stage, it doesn't really add value to what we're trying to do.
I think it's also what I'm hearing what you're saying is asking the question, if we do this, what data do we get, and how useful what is that data is going to be used for? And what is the impact of data? Exactly.
Yeah. And I would often say to people, the two things that I would work back from, number one is, what's your indication? So on the back of your box in the FDA section, this device treats what? Exactly. Not in a vague sense, just exactly what does this device do? And then below that, you'll have claims. So, like in our case, we have a claim like clinic significantly reduces chronic insomnia or something like that. So our indication is we treat adults with chronic insomnia, and then we have all these other kind of indications. But I think people need to realize that they should make that be their number one target and then work back. So if what you're doing in a clinical sense doesn't add to that, it's probably really interesting, and I'm sure you'll love it. But I would absolutely question why you would spend money on something that doesn't either count towards you getting the indication approved or count towards the labeling claims that you can actually make about this treatment that you've just created.
Yeah, I think that I was saying if I'm just saying, do it as a hobby if you really want to know.
You can always go back. We probably, I am quite interested in some of the sleep architecture changes like REM and deep sleep. I think that's interesting, but spending money on knowing that now just doesn't actually move you any further forward. So if we're really successful and we've got extra cash and we want to look at R&D, then certainly that's an area I am very interested in. But it is absolutely not an area that I was including whenever we move forward with our pivotal trials to get the approvals.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful advice. Last question before I let you go. What mistake that you learned that it cost you dearly, that you learned so much from it that now you overcome it and you will never make that same mistake ever again?
Yeah, I mean, there's many mistakes that I could pick from. But I actually think it overlaps with what I've said, but just being confident in the actual path. So if you, or the CEOs out there or whatever, if they have a path in mind and they think this gets us from where we are now to the next milestone, you should absolutely go for that and make that be your number one priority. And the absolute, culture and vision of the company should be everybody should be aligned going forward. If you start to question it and other people want to do something else and someone wants to spend money this way, or do we want to do this piece of research, or want to focus in this area, then you can do a lot of work, but actually you're not moving forward. And sometimes it's hard to see that when you're in the middle of it all. But a few times I've sort of realized, goodness, if I had just stuck to the thing that I said we should do, if we just stuck to that, we would have got here much quicker. So if anyone's starting out, I would say try and define that path as clearly as possible and just really, really, really stick to it, and don't let other people influence if you think it's the right thing for the company to do that.
Yeah. It's always very hard because, you don't know when you think that you have the right path, but then when to take the advice, when not to take the advice is all a decision that you have to make.
Yeah. And actually, just one really quick last thing, where I've seen people make some questionable choices or mistakes, is they have an idea and then a grant or something will come up which isn't their idea, but it's close enough that if they kind of modify it a little bit or they kind of change direction, well, then they're eligible for the grant. But I would really say that is a risky move, because you're doing the grant for the wrong reasons. So you're trying to make what your vision is fit this grant that has become available, whereas sometimes, in my opinion, you're better just say that doesn't fit with what we're doing. Let's just keep going in the direction we said. So I've seen that a few times in UK companies actually.
It's almost like you are chasing the money rather than chasing your vision to make it happen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You're sharing your insight, and it's really helpful.
Excellent. No, thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We hope you found the conversation insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you the latest in health innovation. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn and Twitter for updates on upcoming episodes and more. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in healthcare. I'm Christine Minato, and thank you for listening.